The difference between experience and expertise is simple, Mason Walker once heard an old mechanic say. Experience knows what usually works. Expertise knows why it works. At exactly 9 o'clock on a bright Texas morning, a crowd had already gathered inside the private service facility behind Sterling Motors. Luxury vehicles lined the polished floor beneath rows of industrial lights. Technicians moved quickly between workstations. Engineers studied diagnostic screens. Expensive equipment hummed quietly in the background. Yet despite all the activity, a strange tension filled the building. In the center of the facility sat a black Bugatti Chiron worth millions of dollars. And it would not start. 20 engineers had already examined it. 20. Some came from the manufacturer. Others came from elite performance shops across the country. Each carried impressive credentials. Each arrived confident. None left with an answer. Victoria Sterling stood a short distance away watching another engineer step back from the vehicle. Her tailored navy suit looked perfectly composed. Her expression did not. She checked her watch. Then the Bugatti. Then her watch again. The car was scheduled to appear at a major corporate event later that afternoon. Investors would be there. Media crews would be there. Important clients would be there. The vehicle was more than transportation. It was part of the presentation. Part of the brand. And right now it was little more than an expensive sculpture. Anything? Victoria asked. The engineer hesitated. Not yet. Not yet. She had heard the same answer all morning. Nearby, a cluster of specialists debated theories involving software systems, electrical faults, and sensor failures. The conversation grew increasingly technical. The solutions grew increasingly complicated. The car remained silent. Several hundred feet away, Mason Walker was finishing work on a pickup truck in a smaller repair bay connected to the facility. His hands carried traces of grease. His brown work jacket showed years of honest use. A photograph of his 12-year-old daughter was tucked inside the corner of his toolbox. His phone vibrated. A text message appeared. Do not forget my science fair tonight. Mason smiled and typed back immediately. I would not miss it for the world. He slipped the phone away and returned to work. A few minutes later, one of the younger technicians hurried into the bay. You should see this. Mason looked up. See what? The Bugatti. Mason wiped his hands with a clean shop towel. What about it? The technician laughed. 20 engineers. 0 answers. Mason followed him toward the main facility. The scene looked exactly as described. Expensive laptops. Diagnostic tools. Specialists discussing increasingly complex possibilities. Victoria Sterling stood near the vehicle listening carefully while trying not to show frustration. Mason remained near the edge of the crowd. Quiet. Observant. Invisible. Nobody paid attention to him. One engineer connected another diagnostic device. Another reviewed data logs. A third argued that the problem had to be software-related. Mason looked at the car for several seconds. Then he looked beyond the car. His eyes moved toward a nearby equipment cart. Then toward the floor beneath the vehicle. Then toward a small detail almost everyone else ignored. His expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. The technician beside him noticed. You see something? Mason kept watching. Maybe. The technician grinned. You think you know what 20 engineers missed? Mason said nothing. He simply continued studying the Bugatti while the debate around it grew louder. Somewhere inside the noise, hidden beneath all the complexity, he had a feeling the answer was far simpler than anyone wanted to believe. The crowd around the vehicle continued growing. Every 30 minutes another specialist seemed to arrive carrying fresh equipment and a new theory. The atmosphere inside the facility felt less like a repair shop and more like an emergency operations center. Victoria Sterling remained near the center of it all. She listened carefully as engineers reviewed diagnostics, compared sensor readings, and debated possible causes. Most of them sounded confident. None of them sounded certain. Mason Walker stayed near the back of the gathering. He leaned quietly against a workbench, observing far more than he spoke. Nobody introduced him. Nobody asked for his opinion. To the people surrounding the vehicle, he was simply another mechanic from a nearby service bay. That was fine with him. A senior engineer pointed toward a display screen. The software is reporting normal communication across every major system. Another engineer immediately disagreed. That does not mean the software is functioning correctly. A third specialist suggested replacing several expensive components entirely. Victoria crossed her arms. And how long would that take? The engineer hesitated. Several days. Victoria looked at him without responding. Several days was not an acceptable answer. The event was only hours away. Investors were already arriving in Dallas. News outlets were preparing coverage. The pressure inside the building continued rising. Mason watched the conversation unfold. Then his eyes returned to the vehicle. He noticed something again. Something small. Something nobody seemed interested in discussing. A younger technician standing beside him whispered, "You keep looking at the same spot." Mason nodded slightly. "I know." "What is it?" Mason took a moment before answering. "I am not sure yet." The technician followed his gaze. "You think it matters?" Mason shrugged. "Everything matters." The young man laughed softly. "That is not exactly helpful." Mason smiled faintly but said nothing more. Across the room, another attempt was made. One engineer climbed into the driver's seat while several others monitored systems from their computers. The ignition sequence was performed again. Nothing changed. A few frustrated voices filled the air. Victoria slowly exhaled. For the first time that morning, irritation began showing on her face. She checked her phone. New messages continued arriving every few minutes. Event coordinators. Executives. Investors. Everyone wanted updates. Nobody had solutions. Mason's phone vibrated as well. A message from his daughter appeared on the screen. A photograph of her science project accompanied it. "Do you think mine is the best one?" Mason smiled immediately. "Absolutely," he replied. "I will see it tonight." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked toward the vehicle once more. The contrast struck him. One world measured success through luxury brands, shareholder expectations, and public appearances. Another measured success by whether a father showed up when he promised. To Mason, only one of those felt truly important. Suddenly a loud voice interrupted his thoughts. One of the senior engineers pointed toward a series of diagnostic graphs. "The problem has to be electronic. It cannot be anything else." Several people nodded in agreement. Mason quietly looked down at the floor beneath the vehicle. Then toward a component near the rear section. Then toward the same detail he had noticed earlier. His expression remained calm. The answer seemed to be moving closer. Not because he had more information than everyone else. Because he was paying attention to different information. Nearby, Victoria noticed him watching. For only a second, their eyes met across the room. Then she returned her attention to the engineers. Mason did the same. Neither realized that moment would become important later. For now, he remained exactly what everyone assumed he was. A quiet mechanic standing in the background while experts searched for answers. By late morning, the atmosphere inside the facility had changed. What began as confidence was slowly turning into frustration. Engineers who had arrived speaking with certainty now stood quietly reviewing the same data for the third and fourth time. Diagnostic screens continued displaying normal values. Components that should have failed appeared healthy. Systems that should have produced warnings remained silent. The vehicle sat motionless in the center of the room as if it were enjoying the confusion. Victoria Sterling walked toward a temporary workstation where several specialists were gathered around a series of technical diagrams. "Tell me something has changed," she said. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one engineer pointed toward a screen. "We eliminated several possibilities." Victoria stared at him. "That is not the same thing." The engineer lowered his eyes. She was right. Hours were disappearing. Answers were not appearing with them. Across the facility, event coordinators were calling every 30 minutes. Investors had already begun arriving at nearby hotels. Media representatives were preparing equipment for the afternoon presentation. Every update Victoria received created more pressure than the one before. She had built her reputation on preparation and precision. Today, neither seemed to matter. Meanwhile, Mason Walker remained near the edge of the operation. He had returned briefly to finish work in his repair bay, but curiosity eventually brought him back. Not because of the car itself. Because the situation made less and less sense. He stood quietly beside a tool cabinet, watching another diagnostic attempt unfold. A technician nearby shook his head. "I have never seen anything like this." Mason folded his arms. "Neither have they." The young technician glanced toward the engineers. "You still think you noticed something?" Mason looked toward the vehicle. "Maybe." "That is the third time you have said maybe." Mason smiled slightly. "Because I do not guess." The technician laughed. "Fair enough." A few moments later, another specialist climbed into the driver's seat while several others monitored live data. The ignition sequence was attempted again. Nothing happened. The room seemed to deflate collectively. One engineer removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Another stared at the floor. Victoria checked her watch once more. Every glance seemed heavier than the last. Then something unusual happened. Instead of watching the vehicle, Mason began watching the people. He listened carefully to the questions being asked. Software. Sensors. Modules. Programming. Communication networks. Control systems. The conversation kept moving toward complexity. Nobody appeared interested in starting with the basics. His eyes drifted back toward the vehicle. Then toward a particular area near the rear section. Then toward the same overlooked detail he had been studying all morning. Once again, the feeling returned. Recognition. Not certainty yet. But close. His phone vibrated. Another message from his daughter appeared. "I won second place during practice judging." Mason smiled. Immediately. That is because they have not seen the final version yet. A few seconds later a heart emoji appeared on the screen. Mason slipped the phone into his pocket and looked back toward the facility floor. At that exact moment, Victoria's gaze crossed the room again. This time she noticed him standing in the same place he had occupied for hours. Watching. Thinking. Waiting. Unlike everyone else, he never seemed rushed. Never seemed frustrated. Never seemed eager to prove anything. For reasons she could not explain, that observation stayed with her long after she looked away. Shortly after noon, the facility grew noticeably quieter. Not because progress had been made, but because confidence was disappearing. The conversations that had filled the building all morning were becoming shorter. The theories were becoming weaker. The explanations sounded less convincing each time they were repeated. Victoria Sterling stood beside the vehicle with a tablet in her hand, reviewing another report that offered no useful answers. She lowered the screen and looked around the room. 20 engineers. Hours of work. Endless diagnostics. Nothing. Across the facility, Mason Walker remained exactly where he had been for much of the morning. Watching. Listening. Thinking. The younger technician who had been speaking with him throughout the day returned carrying a bottle of water. "You are still looking at the same thing." Mason accepted the bottle with a nod. "I am." The technician glanced toward the vehicle. "Then tell me what you see." Mason took a slow drink before answering. "I see everyone trying to prove they are smart." The technician laughed. "That is not exactly surprising." "No," Mason replied. "But sometimes it gets in the way." Nearby, another heated discussion had begun among the specialists. One group believed the issue involved software synchronization. Another insisted it had to be an electrical communication fault. Charts appeared on large screens. Technical language filled the air. Mason listened for a moment. Then he quietly stepped away from the wall and walked a little closer to the vehicle. Nobody paid attention. Everyone was too focused on their own theories. He stopped several feet from the rear section and studied it carefully. His eyes moved across the vehicle. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Patiently. The way a carpenter studies wood grain or a rancher studies weather. Looking for what did not belong. Then he noticed it again. The same detail. Small. Easy to ignore. Yet somehow impossible for him to stop thinking about. His expression changed slightly. The younger technician immediately noticed. "What?" Mason remained focused on the vehicle. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." Mason pointed toward a service log lying on a nearby workstation. "How many times was that component checked today?" The technician looked surprised. "That component?" "Yes." The young man reviewed the paperwork. "According to this, nobody checked it directly." Mason nodded. "Interesting." Before the technician could ask another question, Victoria's voice carried across the room. "We are running out of time." Everyone turned toward her. The frustration she had been controlling all day was becoming harder to hide. "I do not need another theory," she said. "I need an answer." Silence followed. No one volunteered one. The room felt smaller than before. Heavier. Then something unexpected happened. Mason slowly walked toward a nearby workstation and picked up a copy of the maintenance records. He reviewed only a few pages before setting them down again. The younger technician stared. "You found something?" Mason looked back toward the vehicle. "Maybe." The technician groaned. "There is that word again." For the first time all day, a faint smile appeared on Mason's face. Then he asked a simple question. A question so ordinary that nobody nearby understood why he was asking it. Who was the last person to drive it before the problem started? Several engineers overheard him. One of them frowned immediately. Another looked confused. The question sounded far too simple for a problem this complicated. Yet as Mason waited for an answer, something told him he was finally looking in the right direction. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Who was the last person to drive it before the problem started? Several engineers exchanged confused looks. One of them actually laughed. Not loudly. Just enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That is what you want to know?" he asked. Mason Walker remained calm. "Yes." The engineer folded his arms. "We have spent 6 hours analyzing system architecture, communication protocols, sensor networks, and software diagnostics." He glanced toward a few colleagues before looking back at Mason. And your big question is who drove the car? A few smiles appeared around the room. Mason did not react. The younger technician standing beside him looked uncomfortable. He could feel the shift immediately. For the first time all day, attention was moving toward the quiet mechanic. Not because anyone believed he had the answer. Because they assumed he did not. Victoria Sterling watched the exchange from across the room. Her patience was already running thin. Yet something about Mason's expression caught her attention. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look defensive. He looked like a man asking a perfectly reasonable question. The engineer shook his head. The last driver has nothing to do with this. Mason nodded slightly. Maybe. The engineer laughed again. There is that word. Several others joined him. The atmosphere grew lighter for everyone except Victoria. She was not interested in jokes anymore. She needed results. Still, she found herself curious. Answer the question, she said. The room immediately became quiet. An assistant reviewed several documents before responding. According to the service records, the vehicle was driven yesterday evening by one of the transportation managers. Mason nodded. Did anything unusual happen? The assistant checked another report. Not that I can see. Mason looked thoughtful. Interesting. The senior engineer sighed dramatically. You keep saying that. Mason smiled faintly. Because it is. Another engineer stepped forward. Look, no offense, but we are dealing with a highly sophisticated machine. The implication was obvious. You are just a mechanic. Mason heard it. So did everyone else. Yet he simply nodded. I know. Then you understand why this is not as simple as it looks. Mason glanced toward the vehicle. Sometimes that is exactly what makes it difficult. Several people rolled their eyes. The younger technician lowered his head, trying not to smile. Victoria noticed that too. For reasons she could not explain, the conversation felt different from every other discussion she had witnessed that day. The engineers were presenting theories. Mason was asking questions. Then his phone vibrated. He looked down. Another message from his daughter appeared. This time it was a photograph of her standing beside her completed science fair project. A handwritten sign above it read Future Engineer. Mason smiled immediately. The sight softened something in his expression. Everything okay? The young technician asked quietly. Mason nodded. My daughter. The technician smiled. Science fair? Mason looked surprised. How did you know? You have checked your phone 3 times today. Every time you smile. Mason laughed softly. Across the room, Victoria watched him slip the phone back into his pocket. For a brief moment, she saw something she had not noticed before. While everyone else in the facility seemed consumed by proving themselves, Mason seemed concerned about something entirely different. Then he turned his attention back toward the vehicle. His eyes settled once again on the same overlooked detail near the rear section. This time the feeling was stronger. The answer was no longer hiding. It was waiting. And for the first time all day, Mason was beginning to feel certain. The laughter faded, but the doubt remained. Nobody in the facility seemed interested in taking Mason Walker seriously. That was not unusual. He had spent most of his life around machines and people. Both had a habit of revealing themselves eventually. The difference was that machines usually did it faster. The afternoon sun now filtered through the high windows of the facility, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Time was running out. Victoria Sterling knew it. The engineers knew it. Even the assistants moving between workstations seemed to feel it. Yet the vehicle remained silent. Mason stood quietly near the rear section one final time. His eyes moved over the same. area he had been studying for hours. Then he looked toward the service records. Then toward a transportation manager speaking with one of the engineers. Suddenly the pieces connected. Not dramatically. Not like a lightning strike. More like a lock quietly turning. The younger technician noticed immediately. "You know, do not you?" Mason looked at him. "I think I do." The technician blinked. "Seriously?" Mason nodded once. "Maybe." The young man groaned. "You are never going to stop saying that." Before Mason could answer, Victoria's voice echoed through the facility. "We have less than 3 hours." The frustration was impossible to hide now. If anyone has an actual solution, now would be a good time. Silence followed. Several engineers looked away. Others returned to their laptops. Nobody stepped forward. Mason glanced at the clock. Then at the message from his daughter still visible on his phone screen. Science fair. 6 o'clock. He made a quiet decision. The younger technician saw him start walking. "Where are you going?" "To ask a question." The technician followed several steps behind. Mason approached the group surrounding Victoria. A few engineers immediately recognized him from earlier. One of them sighed. Another exchanged an amused look with a colleague. Mason stopped a respectful distance away. "Excuse me." Several heads turned. Victoria looked directly at him. "Yes?" Mason spoke calmly. "Would you allow me 5 minutes?" The room became completely silent. One engineer actually laughed again. 5 minutes? Another shook his head. "We have specialists here from 3 states. A third added, "This is not a pickup truck." Mason listened without reacting. Victoria studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in his voice. No attempt to impress anyone. Just certainty. Quiet certainty. "What exactly do you think you can do in 5 minutes?" she asked. Mason looked toward the vehicle. "Find out if I am wrong." A few people smiled at what they assumed was confidence without evidence. Yet Victoria noticed something everyone else missed. He was not asking for control. He was not asking anyone to trust him. He was asking for 5 minutes. Nothing more. The request was so small that refusing it suddenly felt unreasonable. One of the senior engineers stepped forward immediately. "With respect, this is a waste of time." Mason nodded. "Maybe." The engineer rolled his eyes. Victoria glanced toward the vehicle. Then toward the clock. Then back to Mason. Every expert solution had failed. Every expensive diagnostic process had failed. 5 minutes could not possibly make things worse. Finally she spoke. 5 minutes. The room froze. Several engineers immediately objected. Victoria raised a hand and silence returned. Her eyes remained on Mason. "You asked for 5 minutes. You have them." Mason nodded politely. No celebration. No smile. No speech. He simply removed his work gloves from his pocket and walked toward the vehicle. Behind him, 20 engineers watched. For the first time all day, every eye in the room was focused on the mechanic nobody thought mattered. Every conversation in the facility seemed to stop at the same moment. Mason Walker walked toward the vehicle carrying nothing except a small flashlight and years of experience. The room watched him the way people watch someone step onto a stage they never expected to see. 20 engineers stood nearby. Some curious. Some skeptical. Some openly amused. Victoria Sterling remained silent, her attention fixed entirely on the mechanic who had asked for 5 minutes. Mason crouched beside the rear section and examined the same area he had been studying all day. He did not rush. He did not perform for the audience surrounding him. Instead, he worked the same way he always worked. Patiently. Methodically. The younger technician stood a few feet away. "Do you want any equipment?" Mason shook his head. "Not yet." He directed the flashlight toward a small component hidden behind a panel. Then he checked something else. Then something else. Every movement seemed simple. Almost disappointingly simple. One engineer crossed his arms. "What exactly is he doing?" Another replied quietly. "I have no idea." Mason reached toward a connector that had been overlooked because it appeared normal during electronic testing. He studied it for several seconds. Then he smiled faintly. Not because he had solved the problem. Because he had confirmed a suspicion. The transportation manager who had driven the vehicle the previous evening stood nearby. Mason looked up. "Can I ask you something?" The manager nodded. "Sure." "Yesterday, before the issue started, did you move anything inside the storage compartment behind the seats?" The man looked confused. "Actually, yes." Several heads turned immediately. "Why?" Mason asked. "I was transporting presentation materials." The manager shrugged. "A few display items shifted during transport." Mason nodded slowly. "That is what I thought." The engineers exchanged puzzled looks. One stepped forward. "What does that have to do with anything?" Mason stood and looked toward Victoria. "May I?" She gestured for him to continue. Without another word, Mason carefully accessed a concealed area connected to the component he had been observing all day. A few seconds later he revealed a small section of wiring that had been partially displaced. Not damaged. Not broken. Simply shifted enough to create an intermittent connection that escaped standard diagnostics. Silence spread across the facility. The senior engineer stared. "That cannot be the problem." Mason looked at him politely. "Maybe." Several people almost laughed at hearing the familiar word again. But nobody actually did. The atmosphere had changed. Mason carefully restored the connection and secured the assembly exactly where it belonged. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. No dramatic tools. No expensive software. No complicated procedures. Just observation and understanding. Then he stepped back. "Try it now." Nobody moved at first. The senior engineer looked uncertain. Victoria finally spoke. "Do it." One technician climbed into the driver's seat. Every person in the facility seemed to stop breathing. The ignition sequence began. For a fraction of a second nothing happened. Then the engine came to life. Smooth. Powerful. Perfect. The sound filled the building. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. 20 engineers stood frozen as the vehicle idled flawlessly in the center of the room. Victoria stared at the car. Then at Mason. Then back at the car. Again. The younger technician looked like he had just witnessed magic. Mason removed his gloves and checked the time on his phone. A message from his daughter appeared on the screen. "Do not be late." A small smile appeared on his face. Around him, the room remained completely silent. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. The engine continued running smoothly while 20 engineers stood staring at the vehicle they had spent the entire day trying to understand. Some looked confused. Some looked embarrassed. Most simply looked stunned. Mason Walker seemed unaffected by all of it. He slipped his gloves back into his pocket and checked the time again. The science fair was getting closer. Across the room, Victoria Sterling slowly walked toward him. Every conversation inside the facility had stopped. The only sound came from the vehicle idling perfectly in the background. Victoria stopped a few feet away. How? She asked. Mason looked toward the vehicle. The connection was never completely broken. Several engineers immediately moved closer, listening. The diagnostics could still see the system, Mason continued. Just not consistently. One of the senior engineers frowned. But we tested every major electronic pathway. Mason nodded. You tested the systems. Then he glanced toward the transportation manager. I was looking for what changed. The room fell quiet again. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. The explanation sounded obvious now. That was what made it difficult to hear. The younger technician shook his head in disbelief. You figured that out from the service records? Mason smiled faintly. Partly. Then what made you suspect the connection? Mason looked toward the vehicle. Because everyone kept assuming the problem started when the car stopped working. He paused. I wanted to know what happened before that. Several engineers lowered their eyes. Not because they lacked intelligence. Because they realized they had been asking different questions. Victoria continued studying him. What kind of training do you have? Mason laughed softly. Mostly the expensive kind. She looked confused. Expensive? The kind where mistakes cost you years. A few people smiled. Victoria did not. She was beginning to understand that there was more to him than anyone had assumed. You have worked on vehicles like this before? She asked. Mason shrugged. Some. That answer generated even more curiosity than a detailed explanation would have. Some, one engineer repeated. Mason nodded. Enough. The younger technician laughed quietly. That is the longest answer he has given all day. For the first time, even Victoria smiled. The tension that had dominated the facility since morning was finally beginning to disappear. Phones started ringing again. Event coordinators rushed away to share the news. Engineers returned to workstations reviewing the discovery. Yet Victoria remained standing exactly where she was. Her attention never left Mason. You never once told anyone what you thought. Mason looked surprised. Nobody asked. The answer landed harder than she expected. Because it was true. He had spent hours standing in plain sight. Observing. Listening. Thinking. Yet almost everyone had dismissed him before learning anything about him. Victoria glanced toward the vehicle once more. You solved in minutes what 20 people could not solve all day. Mason shook his head. They solved most of it. Several nearby engineers looked up. Mason continued. They eliminated hundreds of possibilities. He pointed toward the vehicle. That matters. The senior engineer stared at him for a moment before slowly nodding. It was the first sign of genuine respect. Mason's phone vibrated again. He looked down and smiled immediately. Another message from his daughter appeared. This time it contained only 4 words. Do not be late, Dad. Mason slipped the phone into his pocket and looked toward the exit. Victoria noticed. You need to leave. Mason nodded. Soon. Yet neither of them moved. Because for the first time that day, the conversation was no longer about the vehicle. It was becoming about the man who fixed it. Victoria Sterling looked toward the entrance as employees hurried past carrying updated schedules and event materials. The crisis that had threatened the entire afternoon was over. The vehicle was ready. The presentation would continue. Investors would arrive to exactly what they expected. Yet Victoria found herself thinking less about the event and more about the man standing quietly beside a workbench checking the time on his phone. Mason. He turned. Yes? Come with me for a moment. Several engineers watched as she led him toward a quieter office overlooking the facility floor. Through the glass walls they could still see employees moving below. Victoria closed the door and faced him. "I owe you more than a thank you." Mason shook his head. "You do not. You saved a major event." "The event was never my concern." Victoria smiled slightly. "Your daughter?" Mason nodded. "My daughter." For a moment neither spoke. Then Victoria opened a drawer and removed a business card. "If you ever want a position here, you have one." Mason looked at the card but did not take it. "That is generous." "I am serious." "I know." She waited. "You are not interested?" Mason glanced through the glass toward the busy facility below. "I already have a job." Victoria folded her arms. "Repairing trucks?" Mason smiled. "Being her father." For the first time that day, Victoria had no immediate response. The answer was simple. Honest. Impossible to argue with. A few seconds later Mason's phone vibrated again. He checked the screen and laughed softly. "What happened?" Victoria asked. She sent another reminder. "About the science fair?" Mason nodded. "Apparently second place in practice judging is unacceptable." Victoria laughed for the first time all afternoon. The sound surprised even her. Mason finally accepted the business card and slipped it into his pocket. "Thank you. You might never call." "Probably not." "Then why take it?" Mason looked at her. "Because respect deserves respect." The answer stayed with her. Down below, several engineers had gathered around the vehicle reviewing what happened. None of them looked embarrassed anymore. They looked thoughtful. They had learned something valuable. Not about diagnostics. About assumptions. Mason extended his hand. Victoria shook it firmly. "Good luck tonight," she said. "Thank you." A few minutes later he walked through the facility. One final time. Conversations paused as he passed. The senior engineer who had doubted him stepped forward. "Mason." Mason stopped. "Yes?" The engineer nodded respectfully. "Good work." Mason returned the nod. "You too." There was no victory speech. No public humiliation. No revenge. Only mutual respect. He stepped outside into the warm Texas afternoon and crossed the parking lot toward an aging pickup truck that had seen far better days. Nearby sat vehicles worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. None of them mattered. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As he pulled away, his phone rang through the truck speakers. "Dad," a young voice said immediately. Mason smiled. "I am on my way." "You are not late?" "Not even close." Relief filled her voice. "Good." Mason drove toward the setting sun while the city stretched out ahead of him. Behind him remained a facility full of experts, executives, and expensive machines. Ahead of him waited a folding chair in a school gymnasium and a girl eager to show her father what she had built. And to Mason Walker, there was never any question which destination mattered more.